The billionaire had everything: power, wealth, and an empire built on control. But when his twin sons were born paralyzed, his world began to crack. Doctors called it a tragedy. He called it a curse. Then late one night, he saw the family's black maid standing over the twins' cribs, whispering something he couldn't hear, her hands glowing faintly in the dark. The next morning, one of the twins moved his fingers. What she did that night would shatter everything he believed about power, faith, and humanity. But was it a miracle or something far more unsettling? Before the twins were born, Alexander Monroe lived a life carved from marble and ambition. He was the kind of man whose name alone opened doors, whose decisions shifted markets, and whose mansion sat high above the city like a monument to success. Every corner of his world gleamed with perfection: white walls, polished silver, and a silence that carried the weight of control. He'd built everything himself, from a childhood of scarcity to a fortune that placed him among the country's elite. To outsiders, he was the image of triumph, a billionaire who had outrun every obstacle. But behind that image was a man who measured worth in results, not emotions. His marriage had become mechanical, his relationships transactional. Nothing touched him until the day his sons were born. Their birth was supposed to be his legacy, two perfect heirs to continue the Monroe Empire. But when the delivery room fell silent, when the doctor's smile vanished, Alexander felt the air leave his chest. The twins were breathing but motionless, their bodies limp, their futures uncertain. The diagnosis came fast, clinical, final. Both children were born paralyzed from the waist down. It wasn't just tragedy, it was humiliation. The man who conquered everything couldn't conquer fate. Whispers filled the hospital corridors, and soon the tabloids caught on. Monroe Heirs' curse, one headline read. He avoided mirrors, boardrooms, and sympathy. His mansion became a place of shadows and routine. Nurses came and went. Specialists failed to deliver hope. His wife retreated into silence, her grief turning to resentment. By the twins' second birthday, Alexander had learned to live around his pain. He filled his home with structure, hiring the best doctors, the most experienced staff, the most devoted caretakers. Among them was Evelyn, a middle-aged black woman who came from the city's poorer districts. She was quiet, deliberate, and carried a kind of calm that unsettled the house's sterile rhythm. Alexander barely noticed her at first. To him, she was another employee, hired to do what others had failed to do: help his children live comfortably within the walls of limitation. But Evelyn noticed everything. She saw the way Alexander stood at a distance from his sons, watching but never touching. She saw the way grief had hardened into pride, how the house itself seemed to mourn in silence. She moved gently through the routines, feeding, cleaning, humming low lullabies that no one recognized. At first, Alexander dismissed her rituals as sentiment, but there was something about her presence, a stillness, a depth, that made even the air around her feel charged. She never complained, never looked afraid, and yet, when the twins cried, they quieted faster under her hands than any nurse before her. As weeks passed, strange things began to happen. Objects in the nursery shifted slightly overnight. The twins' eyes followed something unseen when Evelyn entered the room. One evening, Alexander walked past the nursery door and heard her murmuring softly, a sound that wasn't quite prayer and not quite song. He paused. Something about the rhythm of her voice made his skin tighten. It didn't belong to the world he understood, the world of logic, control, and wealth. And though he didn't know it yet, that night was the first fracture, the quiet beginning of a truth that would soon unravel everything he thought he knew about power, healing, and the invisible lines that divide faith from fear. The night of the storm was the breaking point. Wind howled through the Monroe estate, rattling the glass panels that stretched from marble floor to vaulted ceiling. Outside, the world blurred into rain and lightning, but inside, the air was heavy, thick with fear, exhaustion, and something unspoken. The twins had fallen ill that morning, fever high, breathing ragged, doctors unreachable through flooded roads. The generator flickered, light stuttered, and in that brief darkness, Alexander saw his empire stripped bare. Money, power, prestige, none of it could keep his children alive. Evelyn was the only one who didn't panic. She moved with strange calm, cradling one child, then the other, whispering words Alexander didn't recognize. Her voice trembled like an ancient melody. He wanted to believe it was superstition, desperation in disguise. But something inside him, something primal, knew it wasn't. By midnight, the house lost power entirely. The doctor's voice on the emergency line had faded hours ago. All that remained was Evelyn's voice, steady in the dark. Candles lined the nursery, their flames bending toward her as if drawn by unseen force. The twins' skin had turned pale, their lips blue. Alexander felt his heart fracture with every weak breath they took. He tried to call for help again, shouting orders at no one. Evelyn stopped him. Her tone was low, almost commanding. "You can't help them that way," she said. Her words cut through the chaos, sharp and final. He froze, watching her place her palms over the twins' chests. She closed her eyes and began to hum. Not a tune, but a vibration, low and rhythmic. The sound seemed to pulse through the air, resonating in the glass, in the floor, in his chest. It wasn't music. It was energy. Alexander's mind fought to understand. He was a man of science, of evidence, of control, yet what he saw defied all three. The candle flames rose higher, bending toward Evelyn's hands. Her body trembled, and her breath became shallow. The room smelled faintly of ozone, the same scent that follows lightning. Then movement. A twitch. A small, involuntary motion in one of the twins' legs. Alexander thought he imagined it, but then it happened again. And again. The boy's toes curled slightly, then flexed. The other twin followed, fingers tightening, eyelids fluttering. Alexander's disbelief turned to terror. He took a step forward, but the air around the crib felt charged, like static before a strike. He could barely breathe. Evelyn's voice deepened into something ancient, older than prayer, older than language itself. The storm outside raged harder. Thunder rolled over the mansion, shaking its walls as if nature itself was listening. And then, silence. The candles extinguished. The wind stopped. Evelyn fell backward, gasping for air. The twins cried, loud, sharp, alive. Their voices pierced through the quiet, raw, and impossible. Alexander rushed forward, eyes wide with disbelief. His sons were moving. Their legs kicked weakly against the blanket, their arms reaching for the light. He could hardly stand. The impossible had just unfolded before him. He turned to Evelyn. She was pale, her skin glistening with sweat, eyes closed as though she'd been drained of something deeper than energy. When she finally opened them, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. "What did you do?" Alexander whispered, his voice shaking. Her answer came in a breath. "I gave what was left." He didn't understand until the next morning. The twins woke with full strength, laughing for the first time since birth. Doctors couldn't explain it. The scans were clear. Muscles once declared lifeless were now active, healthy, responsive. It was, they said, a spontaneous recovery. But Alexander knew better. He'd seen the impossible. He ran to find Evelyn, desperate to understand, to thank her, or to demand an explanation. But she was gone. Her quarters empty. Her uniform folded neatly on the bed. No sign of her departure. No message, no trace. Days turned into weeks, and though the twins thrived, Alexander could not shake what he'd witnessed. He began searching for her, first quietly, then obsessively. Private investigators, police, even the church. No one had records of her. No identification. It was as though she had never existed, and yet strange things lingered. The nursery carried her scent, a mix of herbs and smoke. The twins sometimes spoke of the woman with the warm hands who visited them in dreams. Alexander's empire began to crumble beneath the weight of what he could not explain. Investors withdrew, sensing his instability. His wife left, unable to bear the haunted look in his eyes. But he didn't care. All that mattered now was truth. He returned to Evelyn's old neighborhood, a rundown block at the edge of the city. He asked questions, showed her photo to anyone who'd look. Most turned away. One old woman, wrinkled and blind in one eye, stopped him. "You mean Miss Evelyn?" she said. "That woman's been gone near 10 years. Died saving a child from a fire down by the docks." Alexander's blood froze. "That's impossible," he said. "She worked for me this year." The woman smiled sadly. "Then you've seen what we used to call a spirit of mercy. Comes when pain runs too deep for medicine. But it don't come for free." That night, back in the empty mansion, Alexander walked into the nursery. The twins were sleeping peacefully. The air felt still, too still. Then he noticed something faint on the wall beside the cribs. A handprint, small, darkened, almost burned into the paint. He touched it. The mark was warm. The storm outside began again, soft this time, like a whisper. He stood there, surrounded by silence, realizing the cost of the miracle he'd begged for but never deserved. For the first time in his life, the billionaire who believed in nothing found himself kneeling, not to a god, not to wealth, but to something far greater and far less forgiving. Because miracles, he now understood, are not gifts. They are debts, and some debts never stop collecting. In the months that followed, Alexander Monroe's world slowed to a silence he had never known. His empire continued without him. Boardrooms filled, stock prices shifted, deals closed, but none of it touched him anymore. He'd once believed power could bend reality, that money could buy miracles, loyalty, even fate. But what he saw that night dismantled every illusion he'd ever built. The twins grew stronger. They laughed. They ran. They filled the halls with a kind of life that had never existed in the Monroe estate before. But in every sound of their joy, Alexander heard an echo, the soft hum of Evelyn's voice, the storm that carried her away, the invisible hand that had rewritten their destiny. He tried to explain it once to a doctor. The man smiled politely, as if humoring a broken father who'd lost touch with reason. But Alexander wasn't delusional. He had seen the light in her hands, the strength leave her body, the life return to his sons. It wasn't science. It wasn't luck. It was something ancient and human, something dismissed because of who she was. Evelyn had lived her life unseen. To men like him she was invisible, a worker, a shadow, a voice that blended into the background of luxury. Her power, her wisdom, her quiet defiance, all buried beneath society's blindness. He had employed her without ever seeing her. Not truly, until she did the one thing no one else could. She saved what his wealth could not. And yet, when the world spoke of the miracle, no one mentioned her name. Headlines called it a divine recovery, a medical mystery. Not one line spoke of the black woman whose hands carried that miracle into existence. The injustice burned deeper than guilt. It was revelation. The system that glorified his wealth erased her sacrifice, just as it had erased the sacrifices of countless others who healed, built and endured in silence. In his grief, Alexander began dismantling the empire he had built on pride. He sold the mansion first, then the private jets, then the company that bore his name. His final act was establishing a foundation, not for hospitals, not for corporations, but for women like Evelyn. He called it the Hands That Heal, dedicated to supporting black caregivers, healers, and mothers whose strength holds up families, communities, and lives while the world looks the other way. It wasn't redemption. It was acknowledgement, a beginning, not an ending. He never found her again. But sometimes, when the twins played in the garden and the wind moved through the trees just right, he swore he could hear her hum, a reminder that miracles often come through those society refuses to see. Evelyn's story became his mirror. It forced him to confront the truth about power, that real power doesn't come from control or wealth. It comes from compassion, from the hands that work without recognition, from the hearts that heal despite being broken, from those whose value the world has always underestimated. Centuries of injustice had taught society to look away from that truth, to call black strength servitude, black wisdom superstition, black pain resilience. And yet, time and again, it is that same invisible strength that carries the world through its darkest hours. Alexander finally understood that his son's healing wasn't a gift meant for him. It was a lesson, a reminder that what is dismissed as ordinary often holds the extraordinary. In the end, he stood at the edge of the old estate, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, and wondered how many miracles had gone unseen, how many Evelyns the world had forgotten, how many debts of gratitude remained unpaid. The twins' laughter echoed behind him, full of life he could never explain. And as the wind rose, carrying that faint hum once more, Alexander whispered to himself the truth that had taken everything to learn. Some people spend their lives searching for miracles. Others become them, and the world never even notices. So ask yourself, how many miracles have we already overlooked, simply because they wore the wrong uniform, lived on the wrong side of town, or carried skin the world refused to see.